Hi everyone. I felt like I left you guys a little too much alone with the Somerville article, so I've put together this PowerPoint to help walk you through some of the context and references in the Cyrus Marcus Ware article so that it becomes a little easier for you guys to answer the reading questions. So this PowerPoint walks us through the Cyrus Marcus Ware article, All Power to All People. Black LGBTTI2QQ Activism, Remembrance and Archiving in Toronto. So first of all, just some context and notes. So maybe you folks haven't been to an archive. So let's talk about what is an archive. So an archive, according to Oxford Languages, is a collection of historical documents or records providing information about a place, institutions, and or a group of people or groups of people. So what cultural functions do archives serve? Why do we have archives? So archives function to identify, assess, preserve, and make available documentary materials of long-term value, so essential evidence, to an organization or a public that the archive serves. So I actually spent a lot of time in archives on my sabbatical a few years ago, both what used to be called the Lesbian and Gay Archive that we'll talk about in a minute, and the Toronto City Archive. And I did things like I went through old copies of what the Toronto Star used to be called the Toronto Telegram from the 1950s. I was researching gay life in Toronto in the 1950s, and particularly sex work in Toronto in the 1950s. I went through maps that showed zoning so I could figure out where neighborhoods were because things have changed since the 50s. In the Lesbian and Gay Archive, I went through sort of things that people had kept, like buttons and protest banners, old newspapers, letters between people. All of these kinds of things get collected in archives. The Lesbian and Gay Archive has a massive actual political button collection. And yeah, so it's things that you wouldn't expect, like political buttons and banners, things you would expect, like court documents and newspapers, zoning plans, that kind of stuff, etc. So archives also ensure accountability by preserving public records and making them available to the citizenry as is legally and ethically appropriate. So for example, if I donate a bunch of my letters to an archive, they're not necessarily going to hand them out willy-nilly, right? There's something that needs, first of all, a certain amount of time before they can hand certain things out. And there's also rules about what archives can give to certain people. Archives preserve unique or collectible documents. So in Toronto in the 1940s and 50s, there used to be these hilarious newspapers that were kind of like the local edition of the National Enquirer. And these would have just all ended up in a trash somewhere if it weren't for archives. They serve as memory institutions for a culture. So archives help us preserve our social memory. And they support things like I was doing, scholarly, administrative, and personal research. So in locally, we have the archives, and in British Columbia, we have the Transgender Archives. These are two Canadian archives. So first, let's take a quick look at the archives website, if I can make this actually work. Might take a sec. And it might not work at all for me when I'm recording. I only tested it when I wasn't recording, so maybe it's not going to work for me. All right, I'm going to pause the narration and see if I can get it to work. Okay, so I can't open the links while I'm narrating. So you folks, I'm going to post the PowerPoint as well as the link to the narration. So you guys can go into the PowerPoint and take a look at the archives website yourself, and also take a look at the Transgender Archive. It's housed out of the University of Victoria out in British Columbia. Okay, so it'll be that way for the other links that I have to show you too. So I'm just going to talk about them. But please do open up the PowerPoint yourself and go take a look at these just so you know what's being talked about in Ware's article. So Ware says we need to consider what we want to remember and how we want to remember it building an archive of our movements going forward to ensure that intergenerational memory can inform our activism, community building, and organizing. So this is an important point in terms of social movements. We need to know where we've been, right? We need to understand what we've done before. And one of the reasons why queer folks and trans folks are attached to archives is because there have been lots of moments when our histories have been disappeared. So not a lot of folks know that one of the things that the Nazis did was burn down the first ever library of sexuality studies. They burnt the vast majority of Hirschfeld's books, and that there was actually a sort of gay movement in Germany in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, that the Nazis crushed. And much of that was sort of lost to history until about the 70s, when a few gay historians kind of uncovered things and started digging and finding more. So what we want to remember and how we remember it is very important in terms of what we decide to do. Right, so this is why Ware says it informs our activism, our community building, and our organizing. We need to know what worked before. Ware talks about some problems with the mainstream queer and trans archives, and he says that they erase racialized and indigenous histories. He says that they create and inscribe a narrative of struggle and resistance that always begins with whiteness and that is used too often in service of homo-nationalism, gay imperialism, and the vilification of the less progressive other. And we're going to unpack that quotation in a second. Ware says that these archives create a narrative of history and that the queer timeline we're describing / critiquing suggests a seamless march towards rights, with hate crime activism as the apex of history into which the rest of the world must be forced. So we're going to talk about all of this a lot more, but I just want to talk about this last little quote a bit. He's talking about the way that sort of mainstream, particularly lesbian and gay activism, has framed getting rights, which we're going to talk about some of the problems with rights-based activism in a few weeks, and protection against hate crimes is the main goal of the movements. And as we'll be talking about for a while, a lot of people see that as a pretty impoverished goal for a movement. And I'm going to show you a map, and we're going to talk about the ways that these organizations kind of suggest that that is the way that the rest of the world needs to be measured, right? So how many rights do people have? What kind of protections against hate crimes do they have? Is the sort of main way of assessing the sort of quality of life in other places, right? And Ware argues that that isn't necessarily something that works for everyone. And rights leave out a lot of people, right? As we're going to talk about in the next few weeks. I've just said right like a million times. Okay, onwards. So I'm really hoping this video works in narration because Sean is amazing. So let's see. Good. Okay. So I'm going to give it the time that it needs to load up. And for her to talk to you. She does a much better job.
Hi, I'm Sean Fay, and this is Sean This Way. And in this installment, I'm going to be asking, what is homo-nationalism? Homo-nationalism is a term that was coined by academic Jasbir Puar in her landmark text, Terrorist Assemblages, Homo-Nationalism in Queer Times, which marks its 10th anniversary this year. And if you're unsure how to celebrate the 10th birthday of a landmark text in queer theory and Foucauldian biopolitics, then look no further, because I've already thrown the party. At times, especially in activist circles, the concept has become somewhat simplified just to mean any time that LGBT liberation politics could be co-opted by the nationalisms of the far right. For example, the National Front's appeal to white gay people in France based on racist fear-mongering about Muslim homophobia, or in the US, the rise of pro-right LGBT slogans and groups, including, among others, Twinks for Trump. While this phenomenon of fascism or white supremacy co-opting LGBT politics for its own ends is real and alarming, It's not exactly what homo-nationalism is. Homo-nationalism, as Poire intends it, is an analysis or organizing principle of global politics, not a personal ideology that you can choose or disavow as an individual. This isn't about good gays or bad gays. Terrorist assemblages was a rejection of the idea sometimes found in feminist and queer theory of the 90s that the nation state is always heteronormative and that the queer citizen is always an alien or outlaw within it. Instead, Poire argues that homo-nationalism is how acceptance and tolerance for gay and lesbian subjects have become a barometer by which the right to and capacity for national sovereignty is evaluated. So what does this mean? Well, in other words, it means that it's not about when LGBT people and racism visibly join forces, but a critique which basically argues that all liberal lesbian and gay rights movements uphold certain ideas of social progress and modernity. In particular, LGBT equality movements rest on the basic assumption that the Western nation state is capable of expanding to include all marginalized populations and capable of being a benefactor to all its subjects. Poire argues that these assumptions and discourses cannot be true, as they always afford some populations full legal and cultural citizenship at the expense of others, specifically racialized others, both at home and internationally. A simple example would be the progress towards marriage equality. Marriage has been considered the pinnacle of gay and lesbian participation in civic life, and marriage does provide equality with straight citizens, but it also upholds an institution which, for example, entrenches Western sexual and family norms as supreme and exceptional in comparison to those of other cultures. Marriage also upholds the nation state as the supreme arbiter of sexuality in the way that it sometimes allows those inside the institution right to remain or citizenship, while others outside of it can be deported. A more modern example 10 years on could be transgender rights. So, for example, as part of the social and legal process of transitioning within a nation state, a trans woman like me may apply to obtain a female passport. While this can be considered a success of the modern trans rights movement and an example of the excellence of a liberal nation state which allows its trans citizens full participation in national life, the very existence of passports still upholds the sovereignty of the nation state to police its borders, to arrest and detain and deport those who do not have documentation, and its role in using the passport system for surveillance and monitoring of racialized minorities as part of counter-terrorism efforts, as well as all of the capitalist exclusions that come with non-citizenship. Does that mean that I'm not going to apply for a passport? Of course not. And this is what's meant by homo-nationalism being more of a lens to view queer politics through than a bad political philosophy you can simply disavow. However, 10 years on from the release of terrorist assemblages, which was largely considered the lead in queer analysis after 9/11 and the war on terror, we find ourselves in a rather different political landscape. How, for example, do queer communities alive to the critique of homo-nationalism respond to President Trump's attempt to ban transgender people from serving in the US military this year? Trump's intention was not merely to signify that trans people are a burden to the health and vitality of the nation state, but to use the publicly funded healthcare of trans service personnel as a wider testing ground for policies around publicly funded healthcare, and namely whose bodies are disposable. However, in order to contradict the symbolism of the move, it's difficult not to recreate homo-nationalist discourses, namely that US trans citizens are fully entitled to participate in their country's military-industrial complex, or, to put it more bluntly, that American trans people are just as good at killing brown people overseas as cis people. When LGBT rights for the white and all citizened become actively forced into reverse, homo-nationalist discourses entrench themselves in response. So what is the solution? Well, perhaps it's to look at the point of universal healthcare instead of the military, and to fight Trump on the position that some bodies are entitled to public healthcare while others are not. Applying the lens of homo-nationalism should be a call for greater debate and critique of what liberation looks like, its shape, its form, and its limitations. Homo-nationalism is a huge, complex and expansive subject, which I can only begin to touch on in a social media shareable. But if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this video, is that it is not a political position designed to separate good politics from bad politics, but rather better thought of as a structure through which queer politics and liberation are formed. Rather than providing us with answers on the right way to struggle, if only things were that easy, homo-nationalism invites us to harshly critique our own role in global politics, even as we gather under the banner of queer liberation or anti-racist politics. I want to know absolutely anything you think about anything I've discussed in the video today, whether that's homo-nationalism, whether it's Jaz Bipoir's book, whether it's passports, whether it's Trump and trans military personnel, any of it. Hit me up in the comments below, tweet me at Sean Fay, use the hashtag Sean This Way, and don't forget to follow Novara Media at Novara Media. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.
Okay. So that was homo-nationalism in better terms than I could probably ever describe it. Another one of the terms in that quotation is gay imperialism. All right, so what is gay imperialism? Gay imperialism describes the way that Western sexual orientation-based movements operating internationally use human rights discourses to justify imperial impulses of intervention and domination. What did you just say? All right, I'm going to say it again. So gay imperialism describes the way that Western sexual orientation-based movements. So what we're talking about here is sort of lesbian and gay rights organizations that are born in Europe or in North America that operate internationally, right? That have international scope or try to have international scope. They use human rights discourses. So they use the language of human rights. They talk about rights. They look at things from a perspective of human rights to justify imperial impulses. So imperial is another way of saying colonial. So it's to justify kind of colonial urges of intervention and domination, to go to other places and intervene and tell them to do things this way. All right, so, and you'll see when we look at the map in a minute that there's a pretty clear set of other places where these organizations want to stomp in there and say, hey, you should do things this way, right? Gay imperialism references the ways that a focus on Western constructs of sexual orientation fail to value forms of sexual diversity and fluidity, gender variance and intimacy in other parts of the world. Okay, so gay imperialism is also talking about the way that when we focus on this idea of sexual orientation, which is a really historically and culturally specific idea, right? So this idea that the body parts of the person who you are into makes a part of your identity, this sexual orientation idea, is actually born of that very Western and Eurocentric science that Somerville is talking about in her article. So it's kind of the mid-1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, very Eurocentric, very Western idea, this lesbian, gay, bisexual, these identities, and this idea of sexual orientation, all right? And this very Western, very European idea, right, doesn't take into account the fact that in other cultures, whether it's Arab cultures, Maori culture, etc., that there are other forms of sexual diversity and fluidity, that there are other forms of gender variance and forms of intimacy that are just as valuable and arguably also queer, but even just naming it that kind of colonizes it, right? Takes away its origin in a different culture. So this focus on sexual orientation, it also hides racist and ethnocentric impulses. So ethnocentric is when you believe that your culture is the only good culture and that everybody else should do things the way you do, right? So these racist and ethnocentric urges to force other cultures to behave like Western nations, all right? So to stomp into, for example, a place like Somalia and tell them that they have to run things the way we run things in Canada. Okay, so a really good example of gay imperialism is Ellen Page's show Gaycation. All right, it has been critiqued as gay imperialism. The best article about this was on a website called Harlot Media, which has been shut down, and I'm not sure why, but I wonder if it's because often it had really interesting critiques of things, and if that's part of if they got into liability trouble. So no offense to Ms. Page, I think lots of her acting is amazing, but this is a pretty cogent critique. So in the show, in the little trailer for the show, Ellen Page says, "I'm on a journey to explore what it means to be lesbian, gay, bi, or trans all over the world." So just that quotation has all sorts of problems in it, right? So there's some huge assumptions in that quotation about those categories, about lesbian, gay, bi, or trans. It assumes that those categories are universal, that they apply everywhere you go, right? And like I said, they're actually the product of some very Western ideas and science in the 1800s. That they're natural, right? That people are naturally lesbian, gay, or bi. And again, there's some problem with that as an argument, and that they're biological. And what I was hoping for you to take out of the Somerville and the video last week is that these are not biological categories, right? There's actually absolutely no biological difference between gay men and straight men. There's no biological difference between me and a super straight-laced straight girl, right? The biological is not the root of this, all right? These are cultural labels, these are cultural categories and cultural distinctions, which is why we can say that they are specific to certain periods of history and certain cultures, okay? So in this show, Gaycation, there's a lot of what the Harlot Media article calls white savior sentimentalism, right? And you guys probably have all heard of the white savior complex, white savior sentimentalism. It centers white people. It might gesture at racism, but basically white people are the important people. They're the people who hog most of the camera space and the airtime. So in the Gaycation show, Paige and a gay male white friend of hers gallivant around a world insidiously structured for their accommodation. That's a quote. So it's important to note that it is partly their whiteness and possibly partly their Americanness / gayness that allows them to move wherever they want around the globe, right? Right now we're living in a time when all sorts of immigrants are criminalized, are not allowed to move around, when refugees are being left to die in the Mediterranean Sea, in refugee camps all over the place, where people coming to the United States or Canada are being put in detention centers because they're immigrants. They're being treated like criminals because they're immigrants. That people are being deported rather than being allowed to stay where their lives are and where their families are, etc. Right? So it's actually a huge privilege that Paige and her buddy can sort of gallivant about the world freely and stay in nice hotels, etc., when all sorts of brown and black people do not have the same privilege at all. The article also points out that there's nothing new about white folks setting off to learn about the other. The Jesuits who came to Canada in the 1600s to learn about the native people were on the same project, right? And they are the people who developed residential schools, who led conquistadors in the Spanish parts of the Americas to actually kill off the mixed gender folks, etc. So there's a long history of white folks running around the world trying to learn about the other. There's in the article, there's a quotation from the show. So Ellen's male buddy, whose name I didn't write down, says, "If you think you live in a part of the world where there aren't gay people, you're wrong." And the article sort of replies to that, and I'm just going to read you the quotes from the article. So let's be clear. If you think you live in a part of the world where eugenics-based systems of sexual classification, that's what Somerville was talking about in her article, right, did not supplant expansive sexual practices and kinship arrangements of indigenous populations in the service of imperial domination, you're wrong, right? So what the article is saying there is that these eugenics-based systems of sexual classification, that's the idea of sexual orientation, has replaced things like here in Canada, remember I told you the blood people had sort of group families, etc., right? And they were forced by the Indian Act and by the Canadian nation state to get married, to be monogamous, to be heterosexual, and to pass their names down via the male line instead of matrilineal via the female line, right? So this is kinship arrangements being supplanted, replaced by sexual orientation in the service of imperial domination. And then they also reply to this: if you think you live in a part of the world where there aren't gay people, you're wrong, by saying, if you think you live in a part of the world where the very notion of sexuality is unmarked by histories of genocide, colonialism, institutionalized racism, and slavery, you're wrong. Right? So they're sort of pointing out that this idea of gayness is partly also a product of systems of colonization. The racist science that Somerville was talking about is the same science that generated these ideas of sexual orientation. And finally, the article that critiques gaycation talks about the fact that in much of the world, the homophobia that lesbian and gay rights organizations are all up in arms about actually has its roots in sodomy laws that were imported from the European colonizing countries in the 1800s often. And so you can't really, so the roots of this homophobia that's sort of being blamed on the brown and the black people in these countries is actually European. Okay, so a little more imperialism. So this map is from ILGA, the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association, based out of Switzerland. And you can kind of see when you look at the map, right? It makes those places, the nation states that are predominantly white, so North America, Australia, Europe, and I would also say Brazil and Argentina. They're not necessarily predominantly white, but they've been heavily colonized. Right? Look like they're progressive. All right, so they're the green countries. Even the color scheme is very Western, right? Like red, bad, like a stoplight, green, good. And most of Africa and the Middle East here, you can see, is made to look kind of backwards. All right, so they're yellow and red. I found a really rigorous paper by a Somali scholar. Oh, and I'll correct the typo there before I post the PowerPoint. That makes this point. It's a very academic paper, but it's a very good point. And she goes on to talk about sort of some of the bigger problems with ILGA's project and the general kind of gay colonization project or gay imperialism project, right? So hopefully that helps illuminate what gay imperialism is at least. So the last little part of that quote is this vilification of the progressive other. So how do these narratives that are typically constructed by white Western archives contribute to the vilification of the less progressive other? So less progressive means less forward thinking, right? Less sort of cool, less lefty, I guess. So one of the narratives that white Western queer culture and archives create is that every queer had a coming out moment. This is a big part of how we understand gayness in this part of the world, in which they announce to people around them that they are gay or trans these days or bi, etc. All right. So this narrative of coming out is not, however, universally shared any more than the labels lesbian, gay, bi, and trans are. In more collectivist cultures, so we have a very individualist culture in North America. In more collectivist cultures where group cohesion and extended family and community are strongly valued, many people whose primary attractions are same-sex don't come out, right? So I have an Egyptian friend, and her whole family welcomes and embraces her female partner. They are understood to be a unit, right? But no one says the words gay or lesbian. And my friend doesn't feel any need to loudly or publicly declare anything about her sexuality. There is no kind of coming out moment in her understanding of her sexuality. And I have heard queer people in Canada say that this is being closeted, right? That this is a failure to come out, that this is a lack of progressiveness or leftiness or bravery or honesty on the part of the person. But the truth is this isn't a lack of progressiveness on my friend's part. She is a member of Queers Against Israeli Apartheid. She's very, very active. Yeah, she's kind of awesome. But that not having a coming out moment, the not sort of standing up on the dining room table and yelling, "I'm gay," is just the way things are done in her culture, right? There's a different way of navigating the social. So Marcus Ware proposes that we start with a Black, trans, and queer history as a way to orient us toward different pasts and futures and a radically different account of the present and what needs to change. So how does shifting the perspective from which history is presented change how we see, understand, and interpret the past, the present, and the future? So we often talk about history as if it's absolute fact. But the fact of the matter is there's actually an African proverb that says, until lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt shall be from the perspective of the hunter, right? So history is often, or generally even, presented from the point of view of the privileged. Okay, they're the folks who have the time and the resources to generate history. It's presented from the point of view of people who are respectable, right? From the point of view of people who are well educated, all right? A history that comes from the perspective of poor folks, a history that comes from the perspective of marginalized folks and of street-involved folks, for example, values different things, right? So it values community relationships over legislation, right? It values avoiding police, right? Instead of building good relationships with the police, which is what a lot of white middle-class gay folks in Toronto seem to want to do at the moment, right? So there's if you change what perspective history is from, you value different things and you highlight different things, right? And you think differently about what you want to change and how to change it, really. So why, according to Ware, do trans people of color fail the progressive narrative espoused by the white trans movement, right? So Ware says that this progressive narrative is a reductionist one. And when I say reductionist, what I mean is that it reduces complicated things to something that seems simple, right? So Ware says that that narrative reduces history and sort of progress down to acquiring rights, right? And we're going to talk a whole bunch about rights in the next little while. But many of these rights, so let's say marriage rights, are inaccessible to most, and in fact are wielded against so many on the margins of the margins through the prison industrial complex, the war on terror, and the aid development industry. All right, so for one of the examples that Sean gave is actually really useful here. So marriage as a way of advancing citizenship. If a Canadian lesbian marries a gal who likes other women, say from somewhere in Africa, right? Then that means that that person has citizenship in Canada, right? But that citizenship is inaccessible to so many people, right? And because of the war on terror, it's been used as an excuse to even further limit the citizenship of many people, right? So the Muslim ban in the US, etc. So Ware says that this progressive narrative is a narrative that only values gains in mainstream political and cultural spheres, right? And that those spheres are places that a lot of queer, trans, bi, indigenous people of color are locked out of, right? So it doesn't much matter if folks have rights to be gay if they don't have a home, right? If they're not getting enough food, if they don't have access to the medication that they need because they're HIV positive, etc. Okay? So this narrative doesn't value survival skills, building communities on the margins, the victories of resistance to law, or things like, pushing for universal health care. Okay? So the other term in this reading that I want to unpack a bit is presentist, right? Ware talks about a presentist agenda. So what is presentism? Presentism is the application of current ideals and moral standards to interpret historical figures and their actions, right? So it would be presentist of me to assume that a woman who had sex with other women in the 1500s understood herself as a lesbian. Okay, that's presentist. So if I say there have always been lesbians, look, this woman wrote letters about her love relationship with this other woman in the 1500s, obviously she's a lesbian. Okay, so this is presentist because really the word lesbian didn't exist then. All right, the idea that who you have sex with is or should be central to your identity, i.e. sexual orientation, didn't exist then either. So I can pretty much guarantee that whoever this imaginary woman is, she didn't understand herself as a lesbian. All right, there's no way. All right, that is a projection. That's presentism. Right, so those ideas of sexual orientation, of lesbianism, those ideas are product of the late 1800s, right, as Somerville's article discussed. So to project them back in time is presentist, right? It's not actually understanding that time in the way that time understood itself, right? So why does Ware suggest that working with this presentist agenda is problematic or limiting, right? The problem with the presentist agenda is it can only see itself, right? It only sees the right now, and it thinks that the way things are right now and right here is the way everything is / should be, all right? So a presentist agenda can't imagine things as different from how they are right now. So a presentist agenda, it kind of colonizes the past and the future. It ignores how things actually were or how they're going to be, okay? So what evidence does Ware provide to counter the framing of Black, queer, and trans movements as new? Because this is one of the problems in the archives, is that the history of gay movements is understood to be sort of a white history. And then when Black folks say, hey, where are the Black folks? They're like, oh, welcome to the party, right? Like, well, we'll set up a special room for y'all, okay? Which overlooks the fact that there have been people of color involved in these movements right from the get-go. Okay, so countless artists, activists, poets, and community mobilizers within Black, queer, and trans communities in Toronto have done the work of documenting our stories. So, and he lists a whole bunch of really valuable resources and projects and pieces of the history of Black, queer, and trans activism in Toronto. So hopefully that helps you understand the article. It helps frame some of what Ware is saying. I haven't answered all the reading questions for you. I think you're more than capable of doing that yourself, but I wanted to give you a little bit of help in tackling it because I know some of the concepts are a bit dense. So to conclude, I want to read the last little bit of the article to you because I think Ware actually does a better job than I could possibly do summing this up. So, conclusion. I began this article by calling names. I will end it by sharing an encounter that illustrates or perhaps embodies the problem with the archive. Memory is a fascinating process. The more we recall or perhaps repeat our memories of events, the more we begin to remember the memories more than the events. And this is actually a scientifically documented phenomenon. The memories of an elder I encountered for a variety of reasons, including anti-Black racism, transphobia, and the active marginalization of trans, Indigenous, and racialized people from these movements, do not recall our presence at these events and eventually become the event. I recently met with a self-proclaimed elder, a white gay activist whose account of the Toronto bathhouse raids is widely cited. He asked me for an interview, and I was telling him about my own organizing and my desire to build on the important work of trans women of color leading our movements. He leaned forward and said matter-of-factly, "You know it's not true. People nowadays say that trans women of color were there, but they weren't. I was there, I would have remembered." He was so certain that he was a more accurate witness of what had happened in the Toronto and New York histories that he could discount the living stories of trans women. He felt such confidence in his own memory as being the memory, the archive, the impartial record of human history. We simply were not there in his mind, and thus we were ripped from the fabric of time and space. But we were there, and we are, as Miss Major says, still fucking here. And we already exist in the beautiful Afro future. By beginning here, by starting with these genealogies, we can remember that we are here, that we will continue to exist, continue to fight, to struggle for change, and to win, as Assata Shakur urges us. Black trans archives live in the moment of shared story, of names called, of gatherings and celebrations in public space. Our archives live in our bodies and minds, and they span time and space.